7 deadly sins. They exist in each of us. And some say they affect our very souls.
These are death-dealing sins. They will have a severely damaging effect on one's spiritual life.
Lust, envy, gluttony, sloth, greed, anger, and pride. According to Christian theology, committing these deadly sins is as simple as thinking about them.
Scripture says the wages of sin is death.
Each of these sins has a secret history revealing how they came to be deadly. The 7 deadly sins have had an enormous impact on history, society, and our souls.
You cannot transgress God's moral law without someone paying a terrible price.
And the most paradoxical of the 7 deadly sins is gluttony. The 7 deadly sins are vitally important in Christian theology. Yet, strangely enough, the list does not actually appear in the Holy Bible. They first appeared in the monasteries of Egypt more than 300 years after the New Testament was written. In about 375 AD, a monk named Evagrius Ponticus began to list the many temptations to the human soul, narrowing and refining his list until he had distilled it to the most dangerous. Evagrius believed there were 8 terrible temptations that could lead humanity to hell. Gluttony was a sin to Evagrius because overeating impeded one's ability to pray. He wrote, "As fog conceals the rays of the sun, so heavy consumption of food darkens the mind." The 8 temptations of Evagrius would remain known only to monks until 590 AD. At that point, Pope Gregory the Great narrowed the list to 7, changed their names from temptations to sins, and proclaimed that they were deadly. To Pope Gregory, gluttony was deadly to a person's inner and outer life. He wrote, "The belly, when it is not restrained, destroys the virtues of the soul."
Gluttony is a distorted obsession, perverted obsession, where food is the object of our pleasure. People live to eat as opposed to eating to live.
The origins of the sin of gluttony trace back much further than the Christian tradition. In the Stone Age, primitive cultures celebrated mass consumption of food.
If you could communicate with our ancestors a million years ago, no one would think that overeating was a sin. It's very common to find depictions of human form that were meant to portray wealth and health and fertility and good things to be rather corpulent beings.
The sin of gluttony took root in the Greco-Roman tradition of vices and virtues. The classical Greeks worshipped a fit and toned body. At the same time, they also partook in pleasures of the palate. The expansion of the Roman Empire brought a variety of exotic and delectable foods to Rome. So the elite hosted lavish banquets where they dined with gusto. Popular myth claims these decadent feasts were interrupted by visits to a vomitorium, a place where one could vomit in order to make room for more food and spirits. In reality, a vomitorium was actually a passageway from an amphitheater.
Well, the vomitorium, where you kind of spewing out people into a passageway so they can exit the amphitheater. Some writer either deliberately or mistakenly associated the literary descriptions of Roman banqueting, which had really nothing to do with that phenomenon.
While the translation may have been misinterpreted, ancient writers confirmed that Romans binged and purged.
References to sticking a feather down the throat or a finger down the throat, or perhaps more commonly, just simply waiting until the body naturally rejects this superfluous quantity of food. And once the partygoer, if you will, had vomited, then there were always slaves to clean it up and clean up the guy and sort of get him back into the game. He can drink some more.
The Christians' view of the sin of gluttony was a visceral reaction to the hedonism of the Roman Empire. They believed Romans were serving up Satan on a silver platter. The Bible often warns against the evils of gluttony. According to scriptures, the devil used the sin of gluttony to try to lure Jesus into hell.
Jesus, he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, and then Satan came and tempted him. And the very first temptation was to gluttony. He said, turn these stones into bread, fill your belly. And Jesus said, no, not by bread alone does man live, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so that idea of making a distinction between what goes in your mouth and what comes out to be very important.
Christian tradition says that gluttony is a sin because it diverts attention from the righteous path.
Gluttony is a sin against one's own body, one's own holy place of residence where God ought to dwell. And it's literally a death wish.
God was supposed to be the focus of your attention. And if you spend all your time thinking about food, then you're ignoring God.
The faithful believed gluttonous sinners will get their just desserts in the hereafter.
If you are damned, eating is similarly involved because you are consumed by Satan. Enter hell through his mouth, and so where you end up, it's in Satan's guts.
In the 5th century AD, philosopher and theologian St. Augustine preached abstinence in all of its forms. In fact, Augustine believed that enjoying any food at all was an offense against God.
If you take this view of Augustine, that enjoying the pleasure of food is intrinsically sinful, then it's almost as if God has created a situation that you have to sin. You can't avoid it because it's almost impossible not to have the pleasure of eating.
In the 4th century, the emergence of the Christian monastic movement heightened concerns about overindulging the senses. These men of God chose to live a frugal, cloistered existence in monasteries, denying the body of gratification.
You have the formation of Western monasticism and the rule of St. Benedict, where we have a lot of rules about food and drink and how much and when. You have to fast at certain times, and you're not supposed to drink any more than a certain amount of wine, and you can't eat meat and that sort of thing.
And they perceived an excessive preoccupation with carnal pleasure, such as eating and drinking, as something that makes us less human and more animal-like, so therefore they considered that to be sinful.
In the 6th century, Roman Catholic Pope Gregory the Great not only formally listed the 7 deadly sins, the pontiff proclaimed there were 5 specific ways to commit the vice of gluttony.
Eating too much, the form of gluttony that's most familiar to us. Gluttony in that sense was theft from the poor and the hungry. Eating outside of the proper time is an act of gluttony. There were set times to eat, and you weren't supposed to snack. You could also sin wanting your food to be prepared in a very particular or very precise or fussy way. You have to have your food just right. And that was gluttony because you're paying too much attention to food. And the fifth way is that you can sin simply in terms of the strength of your appetite, your avidity. You're thinking about food all the time.
By 1320 AD, writer Dante Alighieri dramatized the ghastly horrors awaiting sinners in his epic poem, The Divine Comedy. In what Dante called the third circle of hell, gluttons are held hostage in a putrid bog where they wallow in freezing rain and stinking slush. Cerberus, a three-headed canine, guards the sinners, who howl like caged dogs. The filthy, cruel weather symbolizes the waste that gluttons have made of themselves by their slovenly behavior.
Gluttons are punished in the upper regions of hell. Chaco, the Florentine glutton, who was just sitting there in a muddy pile of filth. His disgusting environment is meant to sort of mirror what he has done with his own body, corrupting it. So hell is a place of uncomfortable extremes. We have fire, we have ice, everything bad, everything unpleasant.
Of all the 7 deadly sins, gluttony seems the most at odds with itself. It's one of the easiest sins to commit, and one of the most difficult to overcome.
That's one of the ways in which gluttony is unique. Yes, you can be a virgin. You can never have sex at all. But food, you can't escape. You will starve to death. You have to feed yourself regularly.
Many of the vices we have to live with all the time, or we would die or not thrive in our lives, and that is the case with gluttony. We have to eat. We have appetites. We need to take nutrition into ourselves and so on.
Eating may have been a necessity, but for those who overindulged, there would be a price to pay. And in some medieval monasteries, this truth wouldn't stop some of their gluttonous ways. The 7 deadly sins have formed the backbone of much of Christian ethics for centuries. And some say the hardest sin to avoid is gluttony. In the Middle Ages, orders of monks had strict rules about eating and drinking. While some monks feared Satan's death grip, others found ways to gorge without guilt.
The rule said that you're not allowed to have, food or drink in excess of this amount in the monastery. A lot of monasteries in the later Middle Ages had a special room. It was called the Misericordium, which means mercy. And what they said was, this room here, that's not the monastery. It's like an embassy of the outside world. And so you go in through the door and suddenly you're not in the monastery anymore. So the monks would crowd in there and start going nuts and, eating and drinking.
13th century Italian friar Thomas Aquinas warned about succumbing to the sin of gluttony. He believed that the sin opened an invitation to other vices, particularly lust, anger, and sloth. It was the gateway sin.
They are all connected to each other, and when you sin in one way, you are more likely to sin in another way.
Because of your inordinate desire for food and drink, you might engage in other kinds of sinful activities, such as stealing or lying. As a very young child, I used to kind of steal money from my mother's purse so I can go out and buy O. Henry bars, which I loved very much. And so that's a good example of how gluttony actually led to my being a little thief.
The medieval legend of John of Beverley demonstrates Aquinas' theory about the danger of the sin. The story goes that a man made a deal with the devil, who forced him to choose between 3 sins: gluttony, rape, and murder. Thinking it would be the least offensive sin, the man chooses gluttony in the form of drunkenness.
He said, I think I'll just get drunk. I could probably handle that. I've done it before. And of course, what he does is he gets drunk and stumbles home and goes into the wrong room. And he sees this woman in his bed.
Not realizing it is his own mother, the drunken sinner forces himself upon her. He is interrupted by his father, and the drunken man kills him. By choosing the lesser sin of gluttony, he has committed incest, rape, and murder. Sometime around 1200 AD, Christian theologians attempted to cure society of the 7 deadly sins by creating a list of counterparts called 7 heavenly virtues. Temperance, the opposite of gluttony, meant practicing moderation and abstention. In an attempt to practice restraint, St. Francis of Assisi, the 13th century Roman Catholic friar, cooked up a clever recipe to curb his enthusiasm at the dinner table. He often sprinkled ashes over his food to deaden the taste.
Unlike monks who stayed in the monastery and were never supposed to leave, friars went around the countryside, helping the poor, preaching against heresy, and people would often put them up because they say these are doing God's work. And they would be given a meal, of course, and often the meal would be more rich than the friars were accustomed to eat based on their rule. And Francis said, you got to eat it because it's rude. You can't say, no, I'm sorry, I'm too holy for the food. But what you can do is sprinkle ashes on it when nobody's looking so that you won't enjoy it.
Some took temperance to the extreme. Saints Catherine of Siena, Clare of Assisi, and Veronica starved themselves for God. Today, social historians have called these saints holy anorexics.
We know that starvation can sometimes bring on hallucinations, and so perhaps eating very, very little was part of their way of becoming closer to God in a mystical sort of way. But it was also a way to maintain control over their bodies. And this is characteristic of anorexia in its modern, non-religious sense.
Their behavior is remarkably similar to modern women with eating disorders. In 1364, teenaged St. Catherine of Siena renounced the sin of gluttony by renouncing all food. She was reported to regularly use a twig to induce vomiting in order to make herself more pure. In the medieval world of St. Catherine, those who committed the sin of gluttony worried about the diabolical world of Satan. These fears were heightened by artists who filled their canvases with depictions of harsh punishments for sinning. The 15th century Italian painting, The Last Judgment, featured naked gluttons seated around a dining room table from hell. Behind them, demons restrain the fleshy sinners from eating.
The whole point of putting statues and paintings and whatnot inside a church is to provide a sort of visual corollary or backup to what is read from the pulpit. And the priest is saying, don't be a glutton. It's very bad. You're going to burn in hell. If they look up at the picture and say, that guy looks unhappy, his body is not very healthy, then perhaps I will avoid that.
For those who could read, the tormented fate that awaited gluttons also permeated literature.
Hundreds of devotional works provide something akin to a modern psychological self-help book. One way in which these medieval authors try to get us to have self-control is to depict the glutton in such a negative way that if, as I'm about to, gluttonize, if I can coin a verb, it will evoke the literary image, then that will act to inhibit my gluttonous behavior.
While Christianity condemned gluttony, Judaism didn't formally acknowledge the sin.
You're supposed to eat and rejoice before the Lord and thank Him. Also, you have in Judaism a whole series of blessings that you recite for different foods that you're going to consume. Now, if eating was kind of intrinsically evil or something, then you wouldn't have all of these blessings.
Gluttony is only a sin in Judaism in as much as you're enslaved to your desire and you lose a sense of what's more important. If your gluttony involves taking that which ought to be given to other people, or prevents you from feeding others, or blinds you to others' needs, or enslaves you, then it's a sin.
Whether or not gluttony was a sin, ancient Jewish writings such as the Book of Judith warned that wining and dining could get you into trouble. In the Book of Judith, an Assyrian king orders his general, Holofernes, to overthrow Israel. At the siege of the Jewish city of Bethulia, the beautiful Israelite Judith invites Holofernes, an infamous glutton and drunk, to dinner.
General Holofernes was going to destroy the city and put the population to the sword. And she essentially made him think that she wanted him, and he was all set to have a nice, intimate evening with her. And she encouraged him to drink so much that he got drunk, passed out, and she chopped his head off. Judith saved her people. She saved her city.
Islam also cautioned about the dangers of the sin of gluttony.
Gluttony is a sin in Islam. The Quran clearly states, eat and drink, but do not exceed. Do not transgress bounds, do not waste. Excess in anything is ultimately considered a vice in Islam. Eat healthy is one of the commands in the Quran.
In observance of Ramadan, Muslims cannot eat or drink from sunrise to sunset during an entire month.
Islamic tradition mandates that we fast on occasion just to teach us self-restraint and self-discipline because it's good for us. So fasting is one of the mechanisms that's built into the Islamic tradition to teach us or to train us not to become gluttonous.
Christians also practice fasting and prayer as penitence for the sin of gluttony. The season of Lent commemorates the 40 days Jesus fasted in the desert. In keeping with the paradoxical nature of gluttony, some Christians celebrate the coming of Lent with Mardi Gras, a 3-day festival of feasting and drinking.
You're going to have a long stretch of fasting and penance and no fun at all, really, until Easter. And so there seems to have been a realization on the part of church authorities that you need to allow people to let off steam. We like to cut loose every now and then, and people who are prevented from doing that sort of thing get pretty unhappy pretty quickly.
When the Protestant Reformation spread throughout Europe in the 16th century, Lent was regarded as a Roman Catholic institution and as a target. Protestants found it politically useful to highlight Mardi Gras' gluttonous festivities and the fact that it's not an official Christian holiday.
You don't read in the Bible about Mardi Gras and Lent and, and things like that. The Protestant reformers got rid of them because they were also times of celebration and feasting with lots of food and drink and some of the behavior that happens when you have too much drink.
For centuries, much of daily life in Western Europe was governed by Christian doctrine. But as the Renaissance dawned, a decadent aristocracy would usher in an evolution in the sin of gluttony. For centuries, the 7 deadly sins have been the moral guidelines to Christians everywhere. By instituting religious fasts and food prohibitions, the medieval church attempted to rein in the sin of gluttony. In the late Middle Ages and Renaissance periods, attitudes toward gluttony evolved as fine dining became a badge of pride and social status.
With the aristocratic classes, it was very much tied in with their notion of honor. That is, behaving and living in a manner that is appropriate to their aristocratic status. So an aristocrat would dress in fine clothes and live in a fine house and eat fine foods. It was thought to look bad if he ate things that were considered only appropriate for peasants. And so an aristocrat would have to keep a fine table and serve the food on expensive implements and all that sort of thing.
Many nobles dined themselves to death. When King John of England died in 1214, it was written, his sickness was increased by his pernicious gluttony. In 1438, Edward IV died of uncertain causes, widely blamed on gluttony.
My belief is that it was a bad diet. The royalty liked to live like royalty, and they liked to eat fine foods and drinks, often to the exclusion of the sorts of food that we know now is far more healthy.
The Catholic Church instituted a host of dietary taboos, including a religious law against eating meat on Fridays. The upper classes, however, found ways around these religious rules.
It became fashionable in aristocratic circles to employ chefs who could, with great artistry, prepare food that looked like something other than what it was. Let's say it's Lent. You're not allowed to eat meat. You're supposed to eat fish. And so the Duke of whatever would bring out a great big joint of roast beef. And the guests would say, my goodness, how can you possibly serve us this? And he would say, well, taste it. Turns out the thing's made out of fish.
Louis XIV was one of the most notorious royal gluttons. It was said that his stomach was 3 times larger than an ordinary man's of his time.
Louis XIV was a glutton because, of course, he was the King of France and he was expected to live like one. And so he was always serving the finest of foods.
These royal food lovers discovered that even if the sin of gluttony didn't lead them to encounter the wrath of Satan, they'd often still be cursed with gout, indigestion, and heart disease.
Louis XIV gained weight and had health problems associated with indulgence in food and drink. Henry VIII, of course, would be another example, who got very large in his later life, and we know he had severe health problems, ulcers in his legs and that kind of thing.
In 1545 AD, Italian Luigi Carnaro found his gluttonous appetite was going to send him into an early grave. So Carnaro wrote a guide to avoid the sin of gluttony. It became the world's first diet book.
He wrote a diet book and he said, this is the way to perfect health. people tended to read him and understand his life more in religious terms than in medical ones, because he had conquered his flesh. He had conquered this desire for food and conquered his gluttony.
In the early 1600s, the sin of gluttony traveled with the Pilgrims and Puritans who colonized America. Colonies were formed at Plymouth and at Massachusetts Bay. And one group of Puritan immigrants was determined to topple the chapel of Satan in the New World.
American Puritanism was, of course, an offshoot of radical Protestantism in Europe. And one of the most characteristic elements of that type of Christianity was this almost visceral hatred of Roman Catholicism. And they were going to go to America and establish God's kingdom here on earth, reformed and perfected and purged of all of those wicked Romish accretions.
In pursuing this new form of Christianity, the Puritans waged a war on Christmas. They believed the festivities resulted in gluttony. They influenced the Massachusetts General Court to outlaw the holiday in 1659. Violators were fined 5 shillings. Christmas remained illegal in Massachusetts until 1681.
The early Puritans did their best to find out the way the early church was and see what was allowed in the Bible and try to live like that. And there is no sense that Christmas was ever celebrated in the primitive church, and so they didn't do it either.
By the 19th century, gluttony became a societal concern in the U.S. Some believed drunkenness was one of the worst aspects of the sin of gluttony. Concerned citizens band together and launched the temperance movement. Their mission was to stop the sin of gluttony by ending all alcohol consumption.
The temperance movement was a self-conscious effort by women for the most part, although they had religious leaders, especially Protestant ones, who were along for the ride, who didn't like drinking simply because they considered it sinful. But it was about protecting families from the corrosive effects of alcohol as they saw it on the American family.
The temperance movement helped to usher in prohibition, which made alcohol consumption illegal from 1920 to 1933. What started as a religious movement against the sin of gluttony more than 100 years earlier culminated in the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
You have this sort of perfect storm of religious leaders and angry housewives and a government that wanted to promote more industry and productivity in their workers. As well, get rid of drinking and we can accomplish all of these things. And that's the temperance movement, and that's prohibition.
The prohibition law ultimately failed to stop gluttony and drunkenness.
Look at it, Satan. When Jesus Christ was crucified on this cross, you lost.
Some believed it was because the sin of gluttony had a more powerful satanic master, and they believed that some gluttons were possessed by the devil. In the Christian tradition, the 7 deadly sins are viewed as a pathway to hell. An act as simple as eating can become the sin of gluttony if one is not careful. The demon of gluttony is Beelzebub, or the Lord of the Flies. Some Christians identified the insect-embodied demon as responsible for tempting people to become gluttons.
A sin, to be a sin, has to be an act of the will. The devil might suggest it, but we have to commit it. And their job is to tempt human beings to commit sins. But of course, that shouldn't lead us to conclude it's the devil's fault or that the devil made you do it.
Look at it!
Pastor Bob Larson would disagree. He believes demons are oftentimes the source of the sin. And the only cure is an exorcism. Larson, an exorcist, claims to have special powers to purge victims he says are possessed by demons.
A huge man, 300 plus pounds, manifested demons in one of our seminars. And when I asked the demon its name, it said food. The demon of gluttony said, I call myself food because I fill him with food and disease.
Larson exorcises the demonized using prayer and religious symbols.
Sometimes I simply taunt the demon. I can taunt a demon by looking at the person deep into their eyes and their soul and saying, well, Satan, you've done a very good job with this person.
While the Christian belief in sin is strong, others believe that gluttony may be an evolutionary necessity. The physical and moral dangers of the sin of gluttony were outweighed by the necessities of survival in other cultures. South Pacific Islanders experienced near starvation while paddling long distances at sea. So too did nomadic Native Americans, who lived a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. The ability to exist on minimal food was a powerful survival strategy. High body fat was important to cultures that endured these feast or famine cycles. Scientists now speculate that certain groups may have built up a predisposition to the sin of gluttony by developing what's been called the thrifty gene.
In an environment where there are frequent famines, genes would emerge that allowed you to efficiently deposit whatever energy you had as fat. That extra fat would provide some protection the next time a famine came along. But now in modern times, when food is freely available, those same genes confer a risk of obesity.
The environment throughout evolution wired our genes to prevent weight loss. And now the environment has changed so that weight loss is increasingly not a problem, and the opposite is a problem.
Due to evolution, many people now carry an abnormal form of the thrifty gene, which doesn't produce the vital hormone leptin. Leptin signals the body to store fat. Essentially, the hormone tells the body to eat more when fat storages are low and less when fat storages are high. Consequently, leptin acts like an appetite suppressant. The lack of leptin can seem to trigger the sin of gluttony.
These are two mice, one of which is an obese mouse and one of which is a sibling mouse. The only difference between these two animals is a defect in a single gene. And this animal's missing leptin, this animal makes leptin, and the consequence is pretty obvious.
Dr. Jeffrey Friedman discovered this defect in the leptin gene and explains that a lack of leptin in humans can make them unable to control their gluttonous behavior.
There's been some really fascinating work done recently in England by Steve O'Reilly studying the leptin-deficient children. There were reports on the part of their parents that they just went to extreme measures to try to restrain the appetite of these children, literally padlocking refrigerators. There was really nothing that could be done. These children would somehow find their way into the refrigerator and overeat.
In this box is some dissolved leptin. The tubes has some fluid in it.
Leptin is now produced in the laboratory to administer to those with the deficient hormone.
This more or less normalized the weight of these children. Now, this is, of course, an extreme example, but I think it does represent an extreme of the biological drive to eat.
In Friedman's opinion, lack of willpower is not the cause of the sin of gluttony.
Some people might look at this mouse or a leptin-deficient child and say that that individual or that mouse is gluttonous. But of course, in these cases, we know what the basis for that behavior is. It's a lack of this hormone leptin.
By the 20th century, the evolution of the sin would get a boost as scientists looked directly at human brains committing the act of gluttony. The 7 deadly sins have been a moral code for Christians for over 1,000 years. These 7 guidelines were created to warn the faithful that even the basic drive to eat could lead to the mortal sin of gluttony. The 20th century ushered in a change in the perception of gluttony. Church leaders also began to view the vice as a behavioral problem, requiring counseling.
In religious literature, the deadly sins are always construed in the context of some moral religious value system. Whereas in the modern approach, the secularized psychotherapeutic approach, they tend to talk more about techniques. How can I learn techniques that will help me control my overeating or my drinking, etc.?
Due to changing attitudes toward health and fitness, many began to consider the sin of gluttony a moral failure in our modern body-conscious culture.
Gluttony is still very much a sin, and it's something to be avoided. There's also a stronger emphasis on the idea of care of the body, that your body has been given to you by God. And when you eat and drink too much, you are ruining your good health.
Dr. Ellen Schur has conducted experiments to show that throughout history, humans may have had less control over the sin of gluttony than they thought.
If you're trying to understand gluttony or overeating, you have to understand that it's a biological process. We're essentially programmed to not only be attracted to especially high-calorie foods, but to enjoy them, and that system was set up to ensure that we got adequate calories to survive.
Dr. Schur has shown photographs of various foods to human subjects. The purpose was to see how areas of the brain respond to visual stimuli of foods.
One group is a category that I would consider sort of low-calorie foods or healthy foods. Other photographs are kind of your standard high-calorie kinds of foods. It tends to be your sweets and desserts.
The experiments have revealed that the reaction to certain foods is strong, powerful, and automatic.
What we're seeing is that the brain responds much more strongly to these photographs of the high-calorie foods than it does to the low-calorie foods.
In a sense, what we're doing is pitting your biological drive against your higher cognitive drive. And the question in the end is, which wins?
For some, the centuries-old tradition of repressing the desire for the finest food and wine is dying out. Some in our society have embraced the drive for high caloric intake. Today, the gourmet is thought of as a refined person.
We have the famous chefs, and we think that people who like finely prepared or rare, expensive food have an appetite that is sophisticated and to be emulated. So Gregory would say, no, that's gluttony there.
Modern gluttons don't worry about a fiery afterlife, but rather a sort of hell on earth. The World Health Organization claims obesity is now a global epidemic affecting over 115 million people, and the sin of gluttony may be partially to blame.
Although gluttony is not identical with obesity, not everybody who has such preoccupation necessarily is obese. But there is a correlation, obviously, between excessive eating and obesity.
Ironically, these same global organizations point to the opposite of gluttony, hunger. As 115 million people grow fat, 2 billion face starvation.
Many of us live in the context of gluttony all around, not only with an ability to eat whatever we want in whatever quantities. We can see what that means to live so well, too well, in a world where there are so many other people who are impoverished.
While gluttony remains one of the 7 deadly sins, our society is still deeply conflicted about the pleasures of the palate. But one thing seems clear: gluttony will always tempt humanity. Whether it comes from the bowels of hell or deep inside our own DNA.